Hello everyone, welcome back to Threes to Wound, and today we've got a Psychic versus the opposite of Psychic battle showdown for you. We've also got the Warpcoven team reveal, my whole challenge we've been doing over all these weeks. The team's complete, a little bit out of schedule, but you know, COVID, spicy cough, etc. I'm still really happy, so let's jump in and have a look. So finally, the big challenge, if you've been following along, that myself and Ben from Battle Brothers Tabletop have been doing over the last 6 weeks.
Hi, I'm Ben, I like Kill Team, and I want to talk about it.
It's finally come to an end. It's time to show them if you've got them. So we're going to have a quick look at my Warpcoven team or roster that I've completed throughout the 6-week challenge. So the challenge was, if you haven't been following along so far, I do recommend you go back and watch the other videos of the series. It kind of shows how it's all progressed and where the ideas have come from. But we'll cover it a little bit here as well. It was all about building a Warpcoven kill team, and it was up to you how you dealt with that. For me, I decided to do a roster because I just had lots of models lying around, whereas Ben took a very different approach. He was like, well, what have I got here? And then he did this amazing kill team, which hopefully you'll be able to watch his video. It should be up. If not, it'll be up very soon. He did his massively on the cheap with lots of his own crafting skills involved, and it's come up amazing. So you should definitely check it out. So part of this for me was coming up with the lore and everything I wanted surrounding my kill team as well. So for me, the big thing was that my guys weren't going to be what we know and see with the Thousand Suns at the moment. We were going to have these sort of out of time, disassociated Horus Heresy era Thousand Sun Marines. Not essentially the empty walking autonoma, you know, that we're used to seeing from the Thousand Suns, but these young sorcerers, still vibrant, full of life, who have actually just been trapped in the warp for thousands of years, trying to get to the planet of sorcerers, back to Magnus. And they've been unable to for a whole raft of reasons that, well, are mysteries at the moment. I used the tables that are in the White Dwarf edition of the kill team for the Warpcoven, and I literally just rolled the dice and we've gone with what popped up. So the name of them is the Scholastica of Fire. Not the coolest name, but still cool enough. So we're going to stick with it. I did, muck around with the idea of changing it, but it remains. So their squad quirk is they are ghosts of the warp, so that they're meant to be a bit of in and out of the materium. And so I really like this idea that they have been lost and traveling the warp for so long that they have become part of it. And so they are, leaning into that thing of that they are out of time. They're a bit, a bit Legion of the Damned-esque, if you will, of that they're there, but they're not. This also works really well with how it ties in with the all is dust rules and things like that. That 2-up save for me is more that they're a bit, incorporeal. They're not really there. Bullets can pass through them and things like that, which I think is pretty cool. The background they got was Warriors Out of Time. Again, very appropriate for these Horus Heresy era Marines stomping around in the 41st millennium. And lastly, their base of operations, the strike cruiser Covidius Coven, which I thought was a really, really cool name. And I love the idea that these guys have been living out and slowly having their numbers dwindling as they've been traveling around in this strike cruiser now for thousands of years. So enough of that. We heard about that in the last one. Let's jump in and have a look how the models came up. First up, we've got Amarahotep Actora. These names are really great. I rolled for the names as well, but this is my sorcerer leader, and I'm really, really glad and happy with how he turned out. He was all about making a real centerpiece model for the team. I guess the only negative being he really is a big unit, so he's pretty hard to hide, and I'm not sure he fits under all the terrain that he needs to fit under, but this was using a few different kits. This was using the Infernal Master kit, some Grey Knight parts. I think the disc was from the Zangor, what was he called? The Herds Master or whatever the Zangor guy that flies around on one of those was. I had to use, you can probably see too, there's the little light on the base there. That's helping to support him because he was way too heavy for that warp fire to hold him up. So it's kind of had to, I like to think that looks like that's something you'd see on the docking bay of a spaceship or something like that. So I still think it works. And all the bases you'll probably notice too are sort of the more metal base, rusted construct kind of thing. And that was to make sure, it looks like they're on their faithful spaceship. Next up, it's Iskander Haket. He's my other sorcerer, and this guy's using the Scarab Occult Terminators. And I just cut up his banner and changed that up with one from the Zangor set. I've also added some feathers down his back as well, very much leaning into that, Zench, Lord of Change kind of feel there as well. And I really liked doing a bit of wet blending or blending with the contrast paints on that as well. I really feel like it's a great, cool, effective look. I like that they're kind of, got that, not of this world feathers kind of look, which is really cool. And this guy too, for him in the game, I always play him as having some sort of buff to his toughness or his armor save. So it's very thematic. He's always a bit more of my tank unit in the team. Sektoth Meten is the last of my sorcerers, and this guy's got the Warp Flame Pistol because you always should have one of them in your team. Again, here's a few different bits and pieces from a few different kits. Again, some stuff from the Infernal Master, some stuff just from the normal Rubicon kit. Just a few different bits and pieces. Stole the base from a different guy. I think that's possibly maybe Infernal Master base. Chucked a Space Wolf helmet on there because I thought that was pretty thematic. A lot of my conversions, I'm not a master of green stuff or anything like that. So they're more just kit bashing. It's more swapping parts and finding things that work to add a bit of character and just to differentiate them from what you'd get straight out of the box. But I love the colors and the color palette I've used across these guys. I feel like the green fire really contrasts well with everything else. And even using the bits and spot of blue and purple for the gems and eye lenses and stuff like that all adds just to add a little bit of interest in the models as well. Met Tothmet is the Soul Reaper cannon and one of my favorite models just because I think he looks really, really badass. All of the Marines I've done pretty similar, using a pretty similar formula. Just that Horus Heresy armor. To do that, I just use your lead belcher base coat, and then it's contrast paint over it, and then finishing it up with the technical art coat to give it the shine and the gloss, and that helps just make it look a bit, I like the idea it's a bit shiny again, looks a bit like warpy and stuff like that too, and it's a bit more of a throwback paint scheme as opposed to, I guess, the grimdark now of a lot of the other teams, and how I've painted a lot of my other models as well. Azmek Pichet is my Warp Flamer, a cool model. Again, I'd love to see this guy on the table more often. I don't think he's going to get too much of a run though. The Warp Flamer is definitely hard pressed to push out the Soul Reaper cannon, but you should always paint one up. They're still cool. Tolbek Arvida is the first of the guys I assembled actually, and I stole a few bits and pieces here and there to make him look a little bit more dynamic, and he's the first of the Marines that you can, apart from the leader, that you can see his face to show that these guys aren't your typical Thousand Suns Marines. So these guys have all got some form or enough of the psychic power to not have been affected by that because of their time in their warp. So you can see him there obviously manifesting some sort of psychic power. I like to think that's basically he manifests the power that his banner does, and that's his skill. Really happy with how the flames turned out on the banner there as well. Think it looks really cool. Caliphus Bekti is the first of the regular Bolter Marines. You've always got to have some Bolter Marines. I am very interested in running a 6 Marine team as soon as I can, obviously including a lot of sorcerers. But yeah, these guys can still be super damaging, and in the right positioning, using them alongside the sorcerers, they can be really, really effective. Azek Shen is the last of the Marine models that I painted up. Again, just another Bolter Marine, but still a snazzy boy. Now on to my Zangors, or suspiciously human-looking Zangors. I obviously used a big kit bash here, using a lot of Zangor parts, but also using the Cultist of the Abyss kits from Blackstone Fortress as well. I just wanted, I guess the story I wanted to add to this as well was that these are humans that have been stuck. They're the crew of the ship. They've been stuck on this ship for generations now. And as the longer they've been stuck on the ship, they're slowly themselves mutating and falling further and further from the Emperor's light. And they've all gone a bit mad. They all worship Magnus as a god now. So they've got lots of, totems and items to them. The 8-pointed Star of Chaos is in fact the Eye of Magnus to them. So they've got a lot of that kind of thing on it. A lot of their helmets have one eye or are missing an eye slot and things like that. And the masks are, meant to be, I guess, reflecting the horrors that they've seen in the warp, meant to be like warding totems. So that's a bit of what I've gone with there. I love this model though. The champion is definitely my favorite. I think it worked the best and probably needed the least work. It was just a weapon swap. It's just a really cool model. Narat Actera is our horn bearer. And I mean, look, this is a really cool model. I struggled a little bit at first with the color scheme, and I don't usually do too much paint testing, but I tested on a few models before I worked out. I wanted the cultists to have their own feel, but I also really wanted them to look like they belonged aside the Marines. And you can kind of see it ends up being a bit of a cacophony of color, but I kind of like that. It still seems to work really well together. Sanakt Petra is our icon bearer. This guy's really cool. He's one of my favorite models from a character perspective, because a few of the models I was finding it really difficult to get their guns off them basically without wrecking the model completely, and especially in the limited time I had. So I decided with the two models that still carried the auto guns to paint them gold, and they're more like relics. They no longer work, but they're holy relics. They've been passed down from generation to generation. So making sure they've still got their other armaments. And this poor guy's had the banner pole literally stabbed into his back. I like to think there's some kind of big ritual involved in that process, but looks cool. Hakor Hapakrut, yes, you heard me right, is the first of our regular Zangor boys. I made sure with these guys, I gave them all the melee weapons. I'm not a huge fan of the auto pistols in the game for these guys. I'm all about that relentless. And I like them having the shield because they've obviously got that 5-up invulnerable save. So I kind of like having those saves represented by the shields. I also tried to add a little bit of a link here to the Marines as well. Those shields have kind of like a red sheen, just like the Thousand Suns armor. And I also did very subtle light lining through it as well to kind of make it look like you could get a bit lost in it, a bit red warp, a bit of texture look to it as well. Hakatakar Kion, another ripper of a name. Just another one of the Zangor guys here. Really happy how he turned out. I liked sometimes having the shields on the back as well, making sure the operatives still have them. I think it looks cool. Hidara Tamek is one of those models. I added him in a little bit later in the mix. I had one of the old cultists, kind of madman looking guys laying around, and I wanted to get him included because I really think the face that he has molded does not look like a real face. To me, it always looked like a bit of a mask anyway, so I thought it kind of tied in, but then once I started painting up the robes, I wasn't so sure. I was trying to make it that it looked maybe like an old admiral's uniform, so that's why it's kind of that blue kind of color that, I don't know. This is probably the least favorite of my models out of all of them, but there's also some element of cool. For some reason, I couldn't leave him behind. Datafesh Kashtosh. That's right. Wow. Jeez. He's the last but not the least of my Zangors. I really love the dynamic pose of this one. I think it looks really, really cool. Mid-action, mid-swing. Still got the shield. A very, very cool model. So there you have it. That's the roster that I managed to get done in the time. I'm really happy with that. Now, we're about to head into the battle report, and I'm really, really excited. We know this clash is between the psychic might of the Warpcoven and then the psychic antimatter, I guess, of the Talons of the Emperor. So we've got some custodes and we've got some sisters in there as well. So probably not the smartest matchup for me with my first game of Warpcoven. Heading into this was genuinely a nervous wreck because I hadn't used psychic powers and these guys have so many rules. It's really exciting, it's really dynamic, and I love how it works. I was definitely very overwhelmed trying to get my head around it. I swap teams far too often, and my mates definitely give me a bit of stick about it because there was we can't remember the rules because you play a different team every week. And that's true, but that's what I do for you. This is me making content. I have to try and learn all the teams. The other thing to quickly say, I do apologize. You might see some of the models on my team aren't 100% completed at this point. Obviously, this game was played throughout the process, and I had been a little bit unwell with COVID, so I couldn't see my mates for a few weeks, so the hobby was a little bit behind, but we did eventually get the game in, which was great, and that also explains why you may see the very albino-looking Sisters of Silence. I'm so shattered because I painted the armor, and it looks so good. I'm so happy how they're looking, but I wasn't able to finish that with the other part of my plan to get these guys done as well. So please, your forgiveness on the not painted models. I'll do my best to make sure that doesn't happen in the future. Apart from that, let's crack into the battle. Today's mission is mission 1.1 from the Chalnath book, Secure the Relics. There are 4 objectives on the board, and the defender must pick them up and return them to their deployment zone. The pickup action costs 1 AP to perform, and once completed, it doesn't affect the operative negatively. If they die, they place the marker as close as possible to where they died. You can also drop it during a unit's activation for no AP. How to win? At the end of each turning point, the defender scores 2 victory points for each objective marker that is within their drop zone, or being carried by an operative that is within their drop zone. At the end of each turning point after the first, the attacker scores 1 VP for each objective that is not in the defender's drop zone. We rolled off and I won, so I chose to have the Talons as the defender. We went through the big roster breakdown a bit earlier in the video here, so all we'll talk about here is the fire teams that I've selected. First up, we've got Sorcerer number 1. He's got Etheric Flight, which gives him the fly keyword. He's also chosen the Tempiric Discipline, so I'm really big on getting this guy to use Flux Blast. And he's armed for close combat with the Khopesh and the Force Stave. Sorcerer number 2 is going to have Time Walker, so that's going to give him the extra inch of movement. I'm going to be equipping him with Destiny, so he has access to Doombolt, which I think is a great alternative if things are out of range from the Flamer. And obviously that extra movement's really going to help him get that Warp Flame Pistol into range. Sorcerer number 3 has got Empiric Ward, which gives him the 4-up invulnerable for this game. He's also got the Etheric Discipline, and I'm going to use this guy as a bit of a combination. Number 1 with Firestorm to get units that are in cover, but also to pump up the Soul Reaper cannon as well. He's also armed with the Khopesh and the Force Stave. One of my favourite models makes the cut here, and that's the Soul Reaper cannon. It's a fantastic weapon to have on your team, and against Custodes, I'm really hoping it's going to come into its own. With 6 shots, AP 1, I'm really hoping to maximise this weapon's ability to overwhelm my opponent's defense dice, so that even Custodes will take a lot of damage from this. That's the last of the Marines. Now it's looking at what I'm taking, and I'm taking a lot of Zangors here because I'm wanting to get up close and deal a bit of damage as these guys are pushing up the board to get the objectives. I think they'll be particularly effective against the Sisters of Silence. We've got the Zangor Champion. I've chosen the Great Axe with this as well because that gives it the brutal special rule, and I'll be using this champion to get into close combat as quick as possible. I was tossing up between taking the Icon Bearer or the Horn Bearer a little bit, the Horn Bearer giving a bit of extra movement. I decided to go for the Icon though because I think pumping up the invulnerable save, so turning it from a 5 up to a 4 plus, is really invaluable for keeping your Zangors alive. So I've got 1 Zangor Icon Bearer. The last 2 slots in the team's just taken up by 2 Zangor fighters, obviously armed with the Zangor blades because I really want to maximize a Relentless across these guys. So my plan with this team is obviously using the Sorcerers. They're going to be a little bit hurt in this match because they are up against the Sisters of Silence. So their offensive weaponry is not going to be as good, but I'm hoping that I can therefore maximize them against the actual Custodes units. The Soul Reaper cannon is going to be really, really crucial, and I'm hoping to get that up on a vantage point straight away, and hopefully from there be able to dominate the battlefield and protect all those relics, which are all positioned pretty much in a perfectly straight line through the battlefield. The Zangors have got one job and one job only, and that is to tie up the Sisters and kill them off. If I can get them to get some early hits against the Custodes, I'll definitely take advantage of that, but especially with one of the Custodes having the Storm Shield, in close combat he can really render them a little bit useless. For equipment, I put the Sorcerer's Scroll on the leader, so basically letting him take another psychic power from a different discipline when the moment presents itself. This could be a good one if I just find that there's something that's going to do the right amount of damage or boost the right kind of unit at the right time. I also gave him the Arcane Robes, which once per battle lets you turn a critical damage into a normal damage. It's pretty handy and hopefully could keep him alive, or at least on the battlefield for a little bit longer. To finish off, I gave all the Zangor units the Gilded Horns. I just want to maximize their ability and double up their effectiveness with that Relentless. They're going to be rolling a lot of dice with that, so having a 5-up extra critical could be huge. I was wondering which way my opponent was going to go. I was pretty confident he was going to be bringing the Sisters of Silence, but he did have the option to go all Custodes. In the end, he ended up selecting the Custodes with a Storm Shield and this Power Sword. You've got the Custodes with a Guardian Spear, and then 5 Sisters of Silence. So 1 with the Great Sword, 2 Flamers, and 2 Bolters. So a pretty versatile list. Anytime you've got 2 Flamers in it seems pretty good. You've got the, the durability of the Custodes mixed with the Sisters, who with Power Armor are still very durable as well. I don't have a whole bunch of AP weaponry, and although some of my spells are great, they can't be aimed at the Sisters of Silence. So that really takes away some of their effectiveness. I also need to be careful with positioning due to the fact that the Sisters can affect their ability to cast Psychic powers as well. For equipment, the Custodes have taken an Oath Parchment on both Custodes, a Miserable Accordion on the Spear Custodes, or the Mercer Accordion. We're going to stick with Miserable Accordion. And the Vrantine faceplate of the leader sister with the Great Sword. Knowing she's going to be in combat and wanting to keep her alive, this is a great take. On to Tac Ops, and for this game I went with Security as I thought it was probably one of the better choices for this team. It worked really well with what I was actually having to do anyway, with wanting to secure the area and lock up those relics. I also put in the Thousand Suns specific ones, more just because I wanted to see them as opposed to them necessarily being better than the normal ones. I thought I'd let the fates decide which ones I'd get. First up, I drew Hold the Line, which I was really happy with, as the whole point was for the enemy to be, not be near my deployment zone. So this was a great one to double up with how I was hoping the game would go anyway. I also drew Sorceress Ritual, so I was hoping to kick this one off in the middle of the battlefield with one of my sorcerers early game, and then have them sort of overlooking and protecting those central objectives while doing that at the same time. The last one was Grand Plan. I'm not a huge fan of these ones, and I've probably said this in some of my other battle reports. Anytime I have to give my opponent a bit of control over what my objectives are, I don't really like doing that. But fingers crossed, if he selects an operative that's going to be in the danger zone anyway, look, they're all up for grabs. So are all the objectives. They're all up for grabs here, so hopefully he can't hurt me too badly with this. We took it in turns, placing our barricades. I chose to use both of mine to create cover for myself through the middle of that battlefield, as it was quite open and I wanted to be having some safe spots to look over those middle objectives. And I also wanted to use them a little bit to get in the way of my opponent, so he was going to have to, go around objectives as opposed to being, able to just have a clear run at a lot of things. My opponent placed both of his on the right hand flank to slow down any forces trying to flank, which wasn't too much of a bad move. It's sort of funneling me towards the middle, which is kind of what I'm sort of trying to do with him as well, so it could be interesting to see how that goes. My opponent was the defender, so they had to set up first. So I always like this. I actually enjoy setting up second because you can definitely counter deploy, and I like having a team that's a bit more of a counter punch. Knowledge is power, as they say. He started by placing the Shield Custodes to anchor his left flank with a Bolter Sister and a Flamer Sister as backup. Then they had the Custodes armed with the Guardian Spear. He was put in a dangerous position right in the middle of the battlefield. So from there, he was going to be able to push to left or right, or just run straight up the gut. So it was going to be interesting to see what he chose to do with him. The other flank was held down by the other Bolter and Flamer Sister, as well as the Great Sword Leader. To counter this deployment, I placed a heavy force on my left flank, with the idea being to overwhelm the sisters that were all on that side, and then sort of use that to wrap up and roll around that flank onto the side of the team, sort of shortening their deployment zone. I also placed my sorcerer close to objective 3 with a force of Zangors to lock that down. My plan was to trap the Custodes in the center of the battlefield as they went for the easier / less heavier defended objectives in the middle. I then placed my Zangor champion in the middle in conceal to try not make the ruse too obvious, to make sure that I had a unit that if they did charge up in that second turn, I could jump in and get involved and slow them down straight away. The last part of my plan was to get the Soul Reaper cannon up onto the vantage point as quickly as possible. So I placed him as close as I could to the heavy terrain just on that left hand flank there, and this conveniently takes us to the scouting phase. For scouting, I went with the free dash on the Soul Reaper cannon just to make sure I could get him right up against that vantage point as quickly as possible. I really wanted him shooting and controlling the battlefield from turn 1. The Talons went with Infiltrate so they could change an operative's order, and I've got a feeling that's going to be used on the Custodes with the Guardian Spear, who's, ominously staring over the middle of the battlefield. This gave the Talons the initiative heading into turning point 1. It was a really busy initiative phase for Turning Point 1. The Warp Coven kicked off by showing off their grand plan tack-up. My opponent chose the Shield Custodes as the one I had to kill. Of course he did, good choice. And Objective 3, which was on the right-hand side of my deployment zone. I had quite a few units there ready to defend it, I just had to make sure I didn't forget. I also spent 1 CP on Exalted Astartes to be able to shoot twice, hoping to maximise my Warp Flamer, and if the Custodes pushed up too aggressively, it'd be great to get 2 combats against them. For the Talons, they revealed they had Rout as one of their attack ops. This was going to be a bit of a difficult one for them because of course they were wanting to push up but then run away, but good to reveal it early just in case he gets lucky with some shots. The Talons kicked it off the first move of the game as suspected. The Custodes with the spear uses the infiltrate to change his order to engage. He then moves up and targeted my leader, who it appears, because he's a massive model, will be quite hard to hide. The Custodes actually also spent his Oath Parchment here to maximise his hits, so he could get maximum damage through on my Sorcerer. So to counter this, I used my Arcane Robes to turn a critical into a normal hit. He still took 6 wounds, so an auspicious start. Not gonna lie, heading to my first activation, I was actually a little bit overwhelmed. It's a new team, there's lots going on, there's lots of different bits and pieces, and I haven't really used any team at all that's got any psychic shenanigans or psychic powers. So, coming from a background of playing a lot of Genestealer Cult and having a lot of like pleb units you don't care, don't worry about or don't care about, I love usually sending them up and sort of out activating my opponent to make them show their hand. With this team, it's nearly the other way around. It's a lot about buffing and maximizing your team early and to then press the advantage later on in the turning point. So I knew that the Talons wouldn't be able to get to the objectives and take them turn 1. So for this, I set up a little bit defensively and decided I was going to set up to protect the objectives. So let them come up and get them, but then either shoot them off or countercharge them when they go for them. But to make sure my leader didn't die, I first cast Weave of Fate from my Warp Flame Sorcerer so he could reroll his defense dice. I would like him to stay alive. I then positioned that Sorcerer to watch over Objective 3 with his Flamer. This in retrospect was a little bit of a mistake as I actually could have just put him on the objective and he could have done the same thing and it would have got me 1 victory point as part of the grand plan tack-up. This may have been my first of many mistakes, so buckle up. The Talons continued the turn. One of the Sisters of Silence moved up to the center of the board, ready to grab the objective in the next turn. To make sure I had maximum advantage and could protect all of the objectives through the middle of the board, except for the one under this heavy terrain piece, I moved the Soul Reaper cannon up onto that vantage point directly ahead of him. And now he had such a great vantage point, it was time to take advantage of it, and he targeted the Custodes with the spear. Once the Soul Reaper cannon wound up and let rip, the smoke cleared and he'd taken a huge 10 wounds off that Custodes. A great start for him. One of the Bolter Sisters then moved up to the heavy cover ahead of her and brackets one of the Zangors, firing through the gap there and taking off 4 wounds. Next up, I pushed my Zangor champion to the middle of the battlefield. She was still in conceal, but this meant she was going to be able to countercharge anyone or, react left or right, depending what was going to happen in the next turning point. The shield-toting Custodes, feeling very brave, sprints up the battlefield towards Objective 3. Once he arrives, he fires into the Sorcerer guarding it, taking off 6 wounds. It's a silly thing to forget, but for some reason I do still forget about Space Marines, Custodes, all those teams that have 3 AP. You forget about the move, dash and shoot. And still, even with those 6-inch range sword guns they have, they're still very effective. Seeing 2 of my Sorcerers injured so early, I needed to make sure that they could stay in the fight. So I grabbed the Sorcerer who had the fly ability, or my Sorcerer leader, and I was really wanting to push him towards the center of the battlefield so he could begin Sorceress Ritual next turn. I moved him to the middle behind the cover there. Once he arrived, I also used Temporal Manipulation on the Flamer-equipped Sorcerer, giving him 5 wounds back, so that's a better start. The Talons of the Emperor continued to slink up the battlefield. The second of the Bolter Sisters moved up to the heavy cover, targeted the newly repositioned Sorcerer, who directs the bullets safely into the warp and luckily took no damage. Next up, I moved my Zangor icon bearer forward just behind the cover there. It didn't look like he or anyone else was going to get any charges off. I put him into cover and totally forgot to activate his icon. I should have done that anyway, or I should have done this move a little bit earlier. It really could have helped with the saves for the other Zangor a little bit earlier on. The whole of the Talons squad was coming up in a big wave, and the second flamer-toting sister moved up to the objective directly ahead of her. And this was something I was a little bit worried about. Those flamers, especially against my Zangors, could be pretty damaging. Having only a 5-up invul against flamers who are going to hit you a large amount of times on 2s, I needed to find a way to deal with them. And on top of that, I was still really battling with what to do with my sorcerers and how to maximize them. I was struggling with the fact that I couldn't target the Sisters of Silence with their powers. I only did it about 19 times so far at the start of the battle, trying to target offensive attacks against the Sisters, with my opponent very politely reminding me that that's not allowed and can't happen. It was definitely limiting my options, so I decided to focus on the units I could hit. I shuffled my heavy sorcerer across the heavy terrain, where he would be able to target the shield custodes with his fire blast through the big archway there. But to no one's surprise, with such a great save, he only managed to take off 2 wounds. The other benefit of moving him to where I had, though, was he's now in a great position to challenge those sisters who are moving up towards that relic. He's a great close combat beast, so he'd be able to crack some skulls. Seeing this and deciding to show that she was no coward, the Sisters of Silence leader stormed forward and sat right on that objective, daring my sorcerer next turn to come and punch on. My plan hadn't worked so well so far to funnel the custodes into the middle. They definitely just run straight ahead to what they wanted to do so far. But having that flamer that they did in the middle of the board was another unit I wanted to take care of. And considering where it was positioned, I was worried about my Zangor leader. So I moved up the Zangor who'd been hit with the bolter before, already down to 4 wounds, and used him as a bit of sacrificial lamb to put as a more immediate threat to the flamer. The good news was, if he didn't get taken out first, I was very confident he could charge and kill that flamer in close combat. The Talons now moved into Overwatch, having 1 less unit in their team, and they took the opportunity to take some pot shots at the Soul Reaper cannon. This is where all his dust showed just how great it can be, and it really made me regret not taking an all Marines fire team here. The entire Talons team has either bolters or flame weapons, so all his dust would have been huge against them. It really might have helped counteract some of the difficulty I was having with, not being able to target the sisters. At least them shooting a lot of bolt weapons at me was going to be relatively ineffective. For the final activation of the turning point, I moved the last of my Zangors around the back of the terrain to threaten the objectives around the flanks on it. It meant that even if the sister grabbed the objective, any way which she ran away from there, I'd be able to get a model back on top of her quick smart. Although it was a busy turn, there was really no deaths and only a little bit of action. Lots of movement, lots of storming forward and positioning, but it left the scores at 0 all. The initiative was going to be a big role in the next turning point. We rolled off for initiative, and crucially for the Talons, they were able to grab it, and that one hurt a bit. Knowing that this was going to be the turn where things kicked off, this led me to activate Psychic Dominion for 1 CP to help give the Sorcerers the chance to make, the game as difficult as possible for the Talons players. I also revealed Hold the Line, as I knew over the next few turns, the Talons would be heading away from my deployment zone, so I should be able to score this. The Talons also very aware it was about to get down and dirty. They wanted to show off their fighting prowess, so they used Peerless Warriors to give them the ability to put on some hurt. With the first activation of Turning Point 2, the brave shield bearer of the Custodes did the brave and noble action of the smash and grab. He picked up Objective 3 and scarpered back to his deployment zone. This was hard to watch, as not only did I need to kill him for a victory point, but he'd also picked up Objective 3, which was also worth an extra victory point for me if I could hold it for 1 turn. Plus, now he was back in his deployment zone with one of the objectives, so he was going to net them a lot of points and deny me a lot. This is a huge blow early, but plenty of time left in the game to right this wrong. Looking around the battlefield, it was time to ramp up the pressure on the approaching forces of the False Emperor. There was a flamer sitting in the battlefield that needed to be dealt with before she could cause havoc, so I took the Zangor who got hit earlier and charged him in straight away. I wanted to make sure he had the chance to contribute to the team before he eventually fell. So with a flurry of relentless swings, he was able to cut her down, but he did take another 2 wounds, so he was now wounded and only had 2 left. Unwittingly, his heroic charge had led him into range of more of the Emperor's servants, and they were able to spend a CP on Talons of the Emperor, a ploy I hadn't actually seen in action before. It kicked off with the Bolter sister using her bolter to finish off the Zangor covered in her sister's blood. She then tagged in the Custodes, who moved onto the objective and leveled his Guardian Spear at my leader. With a flurry of bolt fire, he put down the traitorous sorcerer, and with his last action picked up the objective, ready to spirit it away in the next turning point. This was a huge move, as not only did it secure that objective for the Custodes, it also netted them 2 victory points for Headhunter and 1 for Rout. This turn was not going my way. The flamer-wielding sorcerer saw his opportunity to put an end to those tricksy Talons. He moved forward and bathed the Custodes with the spear in Warp Flame. And after a quick CP roll on the Custodes save, I was only able to take off a further 4 wounds. Things continued to not look so crash hot. The Sisters of Silence leader with the Great Sword was the next operative to grab an objective and make a dash back to the deployment zone. She did fall just short of getting back home. I decided at this point the stealing of the objectives needed to stop, and my original plan was to charge up and tie up both the Flamer Sister and the Great Sword Sister with the one sorcerer. Unfortunately, I was unable to get the distance for both, so I settled on charging and killing the Flamer. In a perfect world, I would have loved to have then cast a Psychic Power to hit the Great Sword Sister, but due to them being immune to Psychic Powers, they had to settle on a staring contest for now. The bolter carrying sister, seeing the sorcerer approach, hoped to end the staring contest with gunfire, but between some poor rolling on the shots and strong armor saves, the sorcerer was unharmed. The tempting target of the Custodes with the shield was right for the picking for my Soul Reaper cannon. He opened up, but only got 2 shots through, so another 6 wounds were taken, but I needed to get more damage through quickly. The Talons, having lost a few models, now headed into Overwatch early, and the Custodes with the spear took his chance to shoot back at the Warp Flamer sorcerer, who luckily only took away 3 wounds. So much for the Emperor's finest. The Zangor champion was keen to get involved in the combat and saw an opportunity to take out a worthy opponent, charging into the Sisters' leader. A vicious combat ensued, and after some poor rolling on the part of the Zangor champion, which would have seen her slain if the combat had followed, I guess, the logical conclusion, but actually a savvy move by the Talons player saw the sister not use the faceplate, and so she actually lost the combat and died, which allowed the Talons player to drop the objective just in the deployment zone. This would nab them some more points at the end of the turning point, and there wasn't much I could do about it. The Talons Overwatch continued, and one of the Bolter sisters opened up against the sorcerer with the pretty feathers, and obviously distracted by the beautiful plumage, had all her shots either miss or bounce off the armor underneath. The Talons had finished up their Overwatch. As long as I didn't wander into any more of their firing lines, I was able to move up my last 2 of my Zangors in peace. I pushed them both down the flanks to put pressure on the units fleeing with the objectives in the next turn. At the end of the turn, the scores sit 2 for the Warpcoven with 2 relics still secure and 7 to the Talons of the Emperor. This lead is stretching out, and I need to find a way to stop the Custodes hoarding those objectives. Unfortunately for me, the Talons won the initiative again. He only rolled a 2 and I somehow managed to roll a 1. This is dice rolling foreshadowing at its finest. To set myself up with the best chance to do as many things as possible, I decided to spend the CP on Exalted Astartes here again. Talons countered this with Aegeus of the Emperor, giving his units the best chance to survive and defend those objectives. Talons continue to maximize the advantage of the initiative and show how devastating they can be. The spear-wielding Custode sprinted back to their deployment zone, objective in hand. He also then rounded the corner, and with his last AP, he dropped the Icon Bearer, who had been stalking the Shield Custodes on the left flank. That really hurt. On the other side of the battlefield, my Zangor stormed into the bolter-toting sister, wanting to finish her off and secure this side of the board for me. Then I'd be able to pivot my forces and encircle the few remaining enemy units, but then he promptly went and whiffed his rolls, including all his relentless rolls. And after a combat that should have been very one-sided, they both somehow remained alive. My Zangor on 2 wounds and the sister on 3. Very tough dice rolling there. The Bolter sister then shuffled across, getting line of sight on the Zangor champion, and quickly finished her off. The flamer-wielding sorcerer moved up and bracketed the Shield Custodes again, who'd been chasing him around the whole game so far, and it seemed like that trend was going to continue. I was tossing up here though whether to use the Flamer or Doombolt, because Doombolt does give you access to some mortal wounds, so I thought that could be really, really handy, especially to, mitigate the invulnerable save. In the end though, I did go for the Flamer because I was like, well, I'm gonna hit a lot more and I'm just gonna hope to overwhelm the defense dice. But the poor dice rolling continued, and with no CP to spend, I only inflicted 2 damage. Things were starting to look a little dire, with both Custodes still alive and in possession of their objectives, and I was definitely running out of ways to attack them. The Custodes, who had recently been flamed, peered over the top of his crispy shield and returned fire on the Sorcerer, plinking off 3 wounds. Seeing their duel would not end anytime soon, he took the safe option and pushed into the very far corner of the battlefield, making him a very hard target and denying me a lot of victory points. My hand had been a bit forced and I needed to avoid the Talons gaining an insurmountable lead, so to help deny this, I sent my Sorcerer over to finish off the job the Zangor couldn't. Charged in, clubbed the Bolter Sister to death. He then also picked up the objective to secure it for the next turn. Unfortunately now, he was actually stuck in the enemy's deployment zone holding that. After the game, looking at the rolls for picking up and dropping, I may have actually been able to spend the 1 AP to pick the objective up, and then I probably could have dropped it on the other side of him for free. I'm still not quite sure if that's doable or legal or considered good sportsmanship, but in this case, I had to suffer them scoring some more points this turn. The Talons, as they so often do, headed early and into Overwatch. And to add to his failure of his charge earlier, the Zangor, with no ceremony, was finished off. I was not too sad to see him go. For the final activation of the turn, my Soul Reaper Cannon, who'd been biding his time, dashed to get a clear line of sight on the Spear Custodes, and rolled terribly as well. I did manage to blink off a few more wounds, bringing him down to his final wound, but frustratingly close, and heading into the last turn, my options were now so limited. It had been a really frustrating turn, but this is a dice game and you can only be salty for so long before you need to think of a new plan. My opponent has been playing the mission really well and done a magnificent job of getting those objectives with his toughest units. At the end of the turn, I scored 1 more point for the objective still in the middle of the battlefield and 1 for hold the line. But my opponent has 3 in their deployment zone, getting them a massive 6 victory points. The score now sits Warpcoven 4, Talons 13. My plan is no longer to try and win because that's just not realistic in this final turn. I definitely think that ship has sailed, so my plan now was to try and limit more points being scored against me and to get some pride back. We rolled for initiative and I was lucky enough to win for the first time, and believe it or not, I won on a 2. Maybe the dice gods were smiling on me again. For the final turning point, the Talons spent a CP on Aegeus of the Emperor again, and that came up trumps for them in the last turn and was actually what kept that Spear Custodes alive. For myself, wanting to make sure I had full access to the full bag of tricks, I spent my final CP on Exalted Astartes again because my sorcerers needed to do some work. For my big play to get some points back, I surged forwards with my Flamer Sorcerer, hoping to finish off the Shield Custodes. Due to the Talons' savvy move back in the last turn, I actually also had to use a dash as well as a move to get within line of sight and range, so I'd now only get the 1 chance to kill them. Once the dice were rolled, it all came down to Aegeus of the Emperor, and its ability to turn one of my criticals into a regular hit kept him alive with 2 wounds remaining. The dice gods are fickle indeed. Great use of a CP by the Talons General there. The combination of a great ploy and positioning really hamstrung me there. The Spear Custodes, knowing he was in the firing line of the Soul Reaper cannon, decided to stay out of trouble. He dropped his objective safely in his deployment zone, fired at the Sorcerer, but luckily in his haste to then dash into cover, he didn't do any damage. The Soul Reaper cannon had been denied its most valuable target as they hid behind cover. Some would say cleverly, some would say cowardly. So he took out his rage on the remaining Sister of Silence with the bolter. The dice gods continued their jokes and I only managed to take 3 damage off her. Not a game changer, but still definitely made my nose bleed. To rub salt into the wound, the Shield Custodes pranced forward and killed my noble sorcerer who had pursued him all game. I guess he probably had it coming as he hadn't managed to finish him off all game, so, you know, you either kill some or you lose some. The final move of the game was actually really anticlimactic, as my sorcerer with the objective was unable to target anyone with any of his warp spells and couldn't charge anyone either. So with a rueful look over his shoulder, he just walked the relic back to safety, knowing the Talons had won the day, but that the long war continued. The Warp Coven had scored 2 more victory points for the 2 objective relics they had kept safe, and 1 for Hold the Line. Talons, on the other hand, gained another 4 victory points for the 2 relics they had secured. The final score was Warpcoven 7 to the Talons' near perfect 17, a shellacking by any measure. Back to me in the studio. This was what I was worried about. I told you, so many rules, so many things to learn. And that's what happens. That was a rough game. All saltiness aside, I must say the number one thing, my opponent played it really well. Obviously, the Sisters are a great natural counter for the Warp Coven, but he also did a fantastic job the whole game using the terrain to his advantage, making firing lines really, really difficult for my guys, and also making it hard to pursue him and keep firing lines as he ran back and forth through across the battlefield. In saying that, I will still have lots of excuses, and here they are now. 2 things I could have definitely implemented that would have changed the game in some ways. There's obviously a couple of strategic and tactical ploys that really help. There's one for the Warp Coven that actually lets you discard attack op and redraw another one of the ones you could have possibly taken. So that could have been really good, especially after the Sorceress Coven one went to pieces and I clearly wasn't going to be able to do that. Spending a CP instead of maybe some of the other things I spent it on to get a new tack op that I could have potentially scored could have helped. Especially after he ran away with the objective that I needed, and the unit that took it was the unit I needed to kill. That was very frustrating. The other thing too, there's one that lets your sorcerers do a free dash after their activation as well. Things like that could have come in handy just for getting more out of my sorcerers. I always felt like I was a little bit on the back foot between maneuverability and lines of sight, and also actually being able to pursue the opponent or shoot, fight, whatever it was. I kind of always felt like my sorcerers, I couldn't quite get them to do everything they needed to do, and they needed to do a lot of the heavy lifting. I think I mentioned it during the game. All his dust would have been massive. These custodes, the Sister of Silence, nearly all their weapons are 3 damage or less. So all of his dust would have been on all of my marine units. They would have been on 2+ plus save the whole game. That could have been really handy. Apart from that, though, there was just a few silly little things, and that was things like forgetting to capture Objective 3 in the first turn and getting that early victory point. Not that that would have been a game changer, but it would have been a better strategic move. It would have had my operative on the objective. It would have meant he would have had to have fought that operative to get them off the objective, which could have bogged him down, could have let me get other units in there, and all of a sudden that whole flank becomes a different board game. A different game. And of course, custodes being custodes, they can't be injured. So no matter what, it wasn't necessarily the fact I couldn't kill them, but even putting a lot of hurt on them didn't really matter. I couldn't slow them down. I couldn't stop them running away with the objectives. I couldn't stop them hiding, and not having ways to slow them down. And that includes probably my own mistakes too. Probably not targeting them with enough of, I guess, the debuffing or, not letting them use rerolls and things like that, psychic powers I could have used. I definitely fumbled psychic powers. I'd say that's probably one of the biggest issues, and there was a lot of my generalship in this game, but I didn't do a good job of making my troops better and making his less betterer. But that's the joys of a new team. So yeah, I'm going to take it with a grain of salt. I know the next time I play these guys, I'll definitely be a lot better with them. And it was a difficult matchup. So you've just got to go, hey, we can be better next time. A huge thank you, by the way, to everyone on Instagram as well who was tagging myself and Ben throughout this whole process. I'm going to put some of those up on the screen now to show you. A lot of other people jumped on board with the Warp Coven Challenge, built their Warp Covens up, and it was so good to see. We've really appreciated everyone's enthusiasm because it kept me on track, kept me motivated, especially when I was a bit flat. Seeing you guys still working really hard and being involved and sharing that stuff really was so great and so encouraging for me to want to get it done. Not to mention, sometimes it's just great to, to have a good reason to get a team done. And sometimes in Kill Team especially, they're smaller teams, but it's not easy to get them painted all the time. Life gets in the way. So thank you so much to everyone out there who took their time to get involved. We will be doing another one of these probably in a few months. I'm sure there's some new teams or something new coming out. So we'll give you a little bit more notice with the next one. And I'm sure myself, Ben, and we may have one or two other people on board as well to run the challenge and do the videos as well. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments too, maybe if there's teams you'd like to see and what you liked about the challenge. If there's anything you didn't like, hey, let me know. We can always make these things better. So that's it. This video has been pretty long. I hope I've remembered everything. I hope you've seen enough of the new Kill Team. They're going to be back on the channel again very soon, hopefully with a bit of redemption. I definitely want to play them. I want to get my Wormblade back out there, and I've got about 5 other teams on the table to paint as well. So lots of really exciting games coming up. As always, chuck down your comments below who you'd love to see fight in any future matches. Finally going to get the Novitiates done. I've got the Tau Pathfinders done because I got the Chalnath terrain finally done. So I'm going to get those teams done. The Chaos Legionaries are going to be done soon. There's lots of really cool teams coming up. I hope you're as excited about that as I am. Make sure you subscribe as well. Please do. And if you can do me a huge favor, the channel's jumped up a whole bunch lately, and it's down a lot to you guys, and the subscribing goes a long way. But if anyone's ever after any Kill Team content, if anyone's ever talked about it, please feel free, throw my videos out there, get people watching it, because the more people that are following along, subscribing, and those views, they all go a long way to making this content easier to create and encouraging to create as well. So I really appreciate everyone who has jumped on board so far, and look forward to anyone jumping on board as well in the future. In the meantime, have a good day, guys. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Reese, and this has been Threes to Wound.